Good afternoon. It's always a pleasure to be with the National Museum of the Pacific War. I'm Richard B. Frank, and I'm going to do the introduction and background to Iwo Jima. Uncommon valor was a common virtue. It's the famous quote that Admiral Nimitz attached to Iwo Jima. It's engraved now on the Iwo Jima Memorial here in Washington, D.C. As I indicated, I'm going to do some introduction and background material, and my colleagues are going to cover the battle in its aftermath. Iwo Jima is known as Sulphur Island. The sulfur has a particular odor like rotten eggs, and making the place particularly unpleasant. Uh, it's part of the Volcano Islands, which is south of the Bonin Islands, and together they make up the Ogasawara Islands. And with another group called the Isu Islands, they all together make up the Nampu Islands in this archipelago that extends south from Japan. From Tokyo Bay, this collection of islands extends about 230 miles to within about 300 miles of the Mariana Islands. Skipping quickly forward from the Ice Age when Iwo Jima was formed, the earliest inhabitants that we're aware of came in the 19th century, and they were a very colorful band of British, Portuguese, Italians, Hawaiians, and there was one American named Nathaniel Savory who occupied Chichijima, which is one of the Jimas, under British sponsorship. Savory, his descendants lived on Iwo Jima for many decades, and they celebrated George Washington's birthday on the 4th of July until the last ones were evacuated in July 1944. Between 1861 and 1891, the Japanese laid claim to this whole archipelago. There are Iwo and other islands then and to this day are actually part of the Tokyo Administrative District. This is a reflection of the enormous distances we're dealing with in the Pacific, but it's as if New York City had an administrative district that extended down to Savannah, Georgia, to give you some sense of the distances involved. The Japanese regained sovereignty over Iwo Jima after the war in 1971, and they renamed it Iwo-to, which is to this day. Currently, Iwo-to is basically a military base, mainly a large airfield with a small garrison. Until recently, it was only open one day a year to selected guests from Japan and the U.S. for a commemoration ceremony. However, since COVID and the passing away of virtually all the veterans, this commemoration ceremony is now somewhat up in the air. And this gives you sort of a current view of the island. You'll see where the landing beaches are there on the southeastern coast, just a little bit north of Suribachi, which is down there at the far end of the island to your left. And of course, the airfield complex, which was basically built by the U.S. and then extended by the Japanese somewhat, which still exists today. Iwo's about 1,200 kilometers, or about 730 miles south of Tokyo. Its area is about 29.86 square kilometers, or about 11.53 square miles. Iwo is commonly described as having the shape of a pork chop, with the shank of the pork chop extending down to the southwest, which is where Suribachi is, and the bulk of the island, then that large part of the pork chop, is up to the north and northeast. The highest point, of course, is Mount Suribachi, which at the time of the battle was rated as being about 550 feet tall. Iwo Jima has actually gained altitude above the water. Suribachi is now usually rated at about 554 feet above sea level. The airfield is about two-thirds of the way up the island to the northeast from Suribachi. From the airfield, there's a road that winds down to Suribachi, just inland from the invasion beaches. U.S. engineers built a road with many switchbacks up Suribachi in 1945. It's still there. If you walk up it, one of the striking things you'll learn is that parts of Suribachi are vertical faces. So this tells you that the defenders knew there were places where the attackers were not going to be able to come, and were able to concentrate the defenses accordingly. The landing beaches have moved eastward a number of feet over the years. We know this because there's a pinnacle rock that was in the water at the time of the landings, which is now actually on the edge of the actual beach areas. And since the battle in the succeeding 8 decades, the island now is largely covered with greenery, green foliage. Now, let me talk about the strategic background to how we get to Iwo Jima in February 1945. The U.S. Navy had studied war with Japan very intensely from 1906 until just prior to the war. And they did this under the rubric of what they called War Plan Orange. Orange was a color code for representing Japan. And the Navy envisioned a war against Japan would unfold in three phases. The first would be a Japanese offensive, which would target the Philippines and probably Guam. And then there would be a U.S. counteroffensive, which the Navy planned to launch across the Central Pacific. It would end in a decisive naval battle like the Battle of Jutland in World War I, which the U.S. Navy presumed they would win. As to bringing the war with Japan to a close, one of the most important aspects about all American planning prior to 1945 was the Navy, based on its study over many decades, concluded that absolutely positively there should never be an attempt to invade the Japanese home islands. And the rationale was because such an invasion, the Navy believed, would produce enormous casualties, which would break civilian will to continue a war through to a successful, victorious conclusion. All that strategic planning, however, basically went to the back burner from 1941 to 1943. Japan's initial offensive across the Pacific from December 1941 to May of 1942 created one of the great empires in history. As you'll see, when Japan's initial offensive completed about May of 1942, Japan had created an empire stretching over 7 time zones. And within that time zone, there were a total of 516 million people, including the population of Japan. By contrast, Nazi Germany, at the peak of its extent in 1942, had about 360 million people within the ambit of the German Empire at that time. And although on this map, you'll see that the area of China, which the Japanese have occupied, is not all that great, this area was, in fact, the most populous, the most economically productive, and had about half the population of China at that time. Now, from 1941 to 1943, the most important developments with respect to U.S. planning was the fact that in March 1942, the U.S. divided the Pacific into 2 great theater commands. The first of which was under General Douglas MacArthur, who was in command of what was called the Southwest Pacific Area. And the second was under Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pearl Harbor, who had the Pacific Ocean areas. This is a map showing the official outline of the territories that were commanded by MacArthur and Nimitz. If you look down to the lower left, you'll see the Southwest Pacific area covering Australia, the Solomons, New Guinea, and extending northwestward up to the Philippine Islands. Admiral Nimitz had the Pacific Ocean areas, and this was subdivided into 3 subcommands, the North, Central, and South Pacific areas. And as a result of that division of the Pacific, the campaigns that both of these commanders would launch would follow the paths you see here. MacArthur's campaign coming up from the Solomons, New Guinea, on up to the Philippines, and Admiral Nimitz commanding the Central Pacific Drive, which would go from the Gilberts to the Marshalls to the Mariana Islands and on eventually into Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Now, between 1944 and 1945, the planners finally began to confront the issue of how the war with Japan would be ended. And this involved a confrontation over 2 competing visions as to how the final phase of the war against Japan should unfold. General Douglas MacArthur, of course, believed that the basic concept should be a return to the Philippine Islands to liberate them. His rival in terms of a concept of how to end the war was Admiral Ernest J. King, who was the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Navy, Chief of Naval Operations, and the senior naval officer. Admiral King believed, in accordance with naval doctrine, that invading Japan was a path of folly, and therefore the correct path was to bypass the Philippines, take Formosa, which is now Taiwan, and link with China, where the manpower of China and bomber bases from China would enable the U.S. to conduct final operations against the Japanese Empire. King's vision also, very importantly, attempted to meld together both a strategy to actually end the war and also to leave the United States and its allies in a state where there would be a protracted peace, because there would be a situation in which there would be no possibility of Japan or Germany rising again to challenge this peace. Now, there was a great deal of back and forth that went on during this, and I'm paring this down to the most simple elements. The Joint Chiefs of Staff issued a very important directive on the 12th of March, 1944, covering operations that would go into October 1944. The Joint Chiefs authorized General MacArthur to advance down to the end of New Guinea, beginning with a landing on Hollandia, which is about midway down New Guinea in April 1944. Admiral Nimitz would take his offensive into the Mariana Islands starting on 15 June 1944, and then both theater commands would join together to conduct operations at the Palau Islands to clear a path to going back to the Philippines. And this was scheduled to start with a landing on Mindanao, the southernmost of the Philippine main islands, on 15 November. The Joint Chiefs left open the question of whether from this set of operations the U.S. offensive would go on to either Luzon or go on to Formosa. And that, of course, created a great deal of dispute between Admiral King and General MacArthur. In the middle of this back and forth with respect to what the operation should be, President Franklin Roosevelt, who was running for his fourth term as president, decided to make a trip as commander-in-chief to meet with his Pacific commanders, and he arrived at Pearl Harbor in July 1944. And there, of course, he met with General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz, and this is a picture of the president meeting with them on the cruiser Baltimore. Now, in the course of those meetings, General Douglas MacArthur, in his arguments in favor of going back to the Philippines, not only argued on sort of strategic terms, he also argued on moral terms. His argument was that the U.S. had failed the Filipinos in failing to defend them early in the war. The Philippines had been under Japanese occupation and suffering greatly, and the U.S. had a moral obligation to go back and redeem its pledge to defend the Philippines by entering the Philippines as soon as possible. This argument about the moral obligation to go back and relieve the Philippines made a deep impression on President Roosevelt, as well as Roosevelt's Chief of Staff, Admiral William Leahy, who was also along on this message. But contrary to a lot of writings about this, there was no final decision made at that time, nor did President Roosevelt later intervene decisively to direct the operations. That would play out into September with a rather dramatic turn of events. Admiral William F. Halsey had been commander of the South Pacific area from October 1942, conducting operations. And then in mid-1944, he was recalled to Pearl Harbor, where he took up his hat as commander of the Third Fleet. And he would conduct operations with the Fast Carrier Task Force, Task Force 38, which comprised this great collection of carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. He launched a series of operations, conducting strikes in Formosa and the Philippines. And in the course of those operations, he believed that the Philippines were much more weakly held than he had been led to believe. He particularly was impressed with the fact that one of his fighter pilots was shot down over Leyte. The pilot was recovered and brought back stories from the Philippine guerrillas on Leyte that the island was not well defended. Consequently, Halsey took it upon himself to send a message upward through the chain of command recommending a radical change of plans. He proposed that all intermediate operations, except for the seizure of Ulithi, which was in the Caroline Islands as an advanced fleet base, should be dropped, and that the U.S. forces should then mass and strike directly into Leyte in the central Philippines, bypassing Mindanao in the process. This proposal by Halsey, of course, immediately went to Admiral Nimitz. Admiral Nimitz approved Halsey's recommendations with two basic reservations. The first of which, he did not cancel the operation to seize the island of Peleliu in the Palau Islands. And this failure to cancel the Peleliu landing is widely regarded as the only significant mistake that Admiral Nimitz made during the war. In his defense, no one understood at that time how heavily defended Peleliu was, how fortified Peleliu was. And also, he was probably motivated by the fact that the covering forces had already laid siege to Peleliu, and if they were withdrawn, it would make it appear as though the Japanese could claim that they'd repulsed an American landing, which would be good for Japanese morale and not good for American morale. The other thing Admiral Nimitz proposed was that although he was prepared to send his 24th Army Corps, which had been combat loaded, to go to Yap Island as one of the preliminary operations that had now been canceled, he now proposed that if that corps, which he intended to send to Leyte to support the Leyte landing, if there was not an agreement to go to Leyte, that he wanted the 24th Corps to immediately divert to go to Iwo Jima at that time. The message also went to MacArthur. I put it in quotation marks because MacArthur was, in fact, at sea under radio silence, and the individual who actually received the message and had to make a decision was the Chief of Staff, Richard Sutherland. Sutherland, channeling MacArthur's views, believed that he would be quite happy to go to Leyte, as was, in fact, the case, and he also signified MacArthur's approval. Very interestingly, the messages from both Nimitz and MacArthur reached the Joint Chiefs of Staff when they were at a meeting with the British Chiefs of Staff in Quebec. In fact, they were at a formal dinner, and they stepped away from the dinner table and in very few minutes sanctioned the whole change of operations to the Pacific because, as they said, they had the utmost confidence in MacArthur and Nimitz. So there would be no diversion to Iwo Jima. At that point, it was lightly held and not well fortified. Orders were correspondingly issued providing for a landing on Leyte on the 20th of October and a proposal to land on Luzon as early as 20 December. The Luzon landing would have to be postponed. At the same time, Admiral Nimitz adopted proposals by Admiral Raymond Spruance, the commander of the Fifth Fleet, who had proposed that the follow-on operations after Luzon should be to Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Nimitz proposed that, and that was then entered into the strategic planning at that point, and that pretty much set the stage short of an invasion of the actual Japanese homeland. So the question remains, was it a great failure not to go to Iwo Jima in August or in September, October 1944? And the answer is definitely not if you're a Filipino. As it turns out, the Filipinos' food situation was deteriorating very rapidly in 1944. People literally were dying in the streets of Manila. The head of the collaborationist government, Jose Laurel, actually began talking about the fact that it might be necessary to permit 1/3 of the Philippine population to die to save the other 2/3. Now, there were 16 million Filipinos. So Laurel's talking about the prospect of 5 million or more Filipinos dying to save the other 10 million or so. So from that standpoint, clearly there was a great moral requirement that we get back to the Philippines when we did. The basics of this new plan to go to Iwo Jima had Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the Fifth Fleet. He would be overall in charge. This would be coordinated with the first large-scale U.S. carrier strike on the Japanese home islands, which would immediately precede the landing on Iwo Jima. The landing force would be the 5th Amphibious Corps. It was under Lieutenant General Harry Smith of the Marine Corps. That was the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions, which constituted the landing force. Sadly, one aspect about the Iwo Jima operation was a series of controversies about what was done or not done with respect to pre-landing bombardment, both by ships and by aircraft. The one that became most publicized was the failure of the Navy to agree to a proposal by Lieutenant General Holland Smith of the Marine Corps, who was the senior Marine officer in the Pacific at that time, who proposed 10 full days of bombardment of Iwo Jima prior to landing. And Smith's proposal was approved by Vice Admiral Richmond K. Turner, who was head of the amphibious force, and he forwarded that to Spruance recommending approval, but Spruance turned it down. And this led to much bitterness in a post-war debate. Spruance was basically motivated by the fact that the close proximity of the Iwo Jima and Okinawa operations put an important logistical issue before him in terms of loading and reloading the bombardment ships with ammunition. And there was also the issue it had to be closely coordinated with that carrier strike on Tokyo. And that was the basic reasons that Spruance gave for turning down the extended bombardment. This issue, however, really ties into something else that I want to get into now, which is basically that the whole Iwo Jima campaign was centered around the fact that we encountered probably the most skillful Japanese general we ran into during the entire war. In July 1944, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kurabayashi was sent to take command on Iwo Jima. Kurabayashi was one of the most intelligent Imperial Army officers that we encountered in World War II, and there weren't a whole lot in that category. He had studied in the U.S. He had a deep appreciation of American industrial prowess. He also had a deep appreciation of exactly what Japan's situation was by the mid-part of 1944. And he decided that the most important thing he could do with his efforts to defend Iwo Jima would involve radically changing the plans of defense of the island. And he proposed that he would attempt to conduct a protracted defense to inflict maximum casualties on the U.S. and delay further U.S. operations as far as possible. To that end, he intended to mount the defenses in the northern part of the island on very, very favorable terrain. In addition to that, he directed specifically that there be none of these counterattacks at night, which the Americans typically call bonsai attacks, which typically were very wasteful of Japanese manpower and typically accomplished very little. He also intended to create an absolute fortress in the northern part of Iwo Jima, and he abandoned any realistic effort to actually defeat the initial landing on Iwo Jima, although he would certainly subject that landing to heavy firepower. Kurabayashi directed his entire garrison to dig and dig and dig to create this fortress. He eventually created a total of about 11 miles of tunnels and caves, and this were connected to literally hundreds of pillboxes and bunkers, as well as command and support facilities like hospitals that he made into a gigantic fortress, probably the most fortified piece of real estate in the entirety of World War II. And those defenses were all tied together to provide mutual support to make it an extraordinarily difficult fortress to attack. His main forces were from the Imperial Army, and he had about 12,700 men, including the 109th Division, which he directly commanded, which actually had a numerical strength of only about 5,000, which was only about half the normal strength of a Japanese division. However, there was the 2nd Independent Mixed Brigade. The Japanese Army used very extensively brigade-sized units, and this one in particular was very strong, about half the size of the division. In addition to this, there was the 145th Regiment with about 2,700 men on hand. Supplementing the Imperial Army garrison was an Imperial Navy garrison, which included construction and support troops, numbering a total of about 7,000, we believe. However, the main part of the Navy garrison, which was the combat force, was about 2,200. Altogether, these were under a rear admiral named Ichimaru, who basically would try to coordinate his efforts with that of Kurabashi, although he would eventually go off on his own and launch some offensive that Kurabashi would not have approved of. The total strength of the Japanese garrison remains in doubt somewhat to this day. It could have been as low as 18,000. It could have been high as about 22,000. I think it probably was close to 21,000. It's about as close as we're going to get on the actual strength of the garrison that the Japanese had on Iwo Jima in February 1945. What was more impressive than the number of men on hand was the fact that Kurabashi's command contained an enormous set of armaments, artillery in particular, 361 artillery pieces of 75 millimeter or greater caliber. You had about 69 anti-tank guns of 37 and 47 millimeter. The 47 millimeter guns, in fact, were very important because they could penetrate the U.S. Sherman tanks at almost any range. There were 12 of these gigantic 12-inch or 320 millimeter mortars, and there were 65 medium and light mortars. And in addition to that, there were 70 rocket projectors, one set of which could throw projectiles that weighed as much as 550 pounds. The Marines said that they looked like they were trash cans being thrown through the air. And of course, they would be devastating when they hit in terms of blast. He also had 33 naval guns, 97 anti-aircraft guns, and there were over 200 automatic anti-aircraft guns of the 20 millimeter or 25 millimeter caliber, as well as a 26 tank regiment with 28 tanks, which were dug in to serve basically as armored pillboxes. Iwo Jima was distinguished by the fact that in the lead up to the invasion, the Army in particular proposed that a poison gas be used. It seemed like an ideal target. There were no civilians present. It was a small island. It was heavily garrisoned. And it went all the way up to President Roosevelt, and President Roosevelt reaffirmed his policy, which he set forth in 1942, that the U.S. would not be the first user of chemical or biological weapons. And Roosevelt then turned it down. I should point that this issue of the use of poison gas was not unique to Iwo Jima. This would come up again with respect to the invasion of Kyushu planned for November 1945. General Marshall would propose that the U.S. use poison gas to bypass Japanese positions which were holding out. And they were protracting operations and causing what Marshall regarded as unnecessary U.S. casualties. But President Truman would again reaffirm President Roosevelt's policy of no first use, and they would not be authorized for use against Kyushu, at least prior to the landing. And this gets to the second part of the controversies that existed over the pre-landing bombardment, both by air and by sea. Now, I can fully understand why any Marine who served on Iwo Jima would have begrudged any round from 50 caliber up to 16-inch naval guns and 2,000-pound bombs that was not used to bombard the island and potentially save the life of one of his comrades who was lost on Iwo Jima. The basic problem was, however, that Kurabashi's forces were so heavily dug into Iwo Jima's soil in the caves and far underground that the only way to effectively destroy the installations was by aim fire carefully adjusted onto the actual targets. This general scattershot, a large bombardment, was very ineffective in terms of inflicting serious damage on the defenses. And given the size of the northern part of Iwo Jima and the forces that were available to bombard, there really was not going to be any great effect to further bombardment efforts prior to the fact when the Marines got on the island. Likewise, there were 74 days of bombing of Iwo Jima prior to the landing, and likewise, this was basically ineffective. There were two great intelligence failures which became evident in the aftermath of Iwo Jima. The first of which was that there had been a serious underestimate of the number of Japanese on Iwo Jima. The pre-landing estimate was that there were only 13 to 14,000, and as I mentioned, the actual garrison was probably around 21,000 Japanese defenders. The other problem was that there was a complete failure to recognize Kiribati's scheme to make the northern part of the island the main defense anchor for holding the entire island. It's possible that this failure was also connected to the fact that there unfortunately was a rotation of almost all the experienced photo interpreters just prior to the Iwo Jima operation, and the interpreters that replaced them were not nearly experienced and probably were not as capable of discerning exactly what the Japanese were up to. 2 days before the actual invasion itself, underwater demolition teams, comprised of what were called at that time frogmen, came in to clear the invasion beaches and make sure they were clear for the landing force to come in 2 days later. These underwater demolition teams were covered by 12 LCI, landing craft infantry gunboats, which were converted for the purpose of fire support. There were 12 of these that, in a line that came up approaching to support the UDT teams. The Japanese mistook these for the beginning of the actual invasion and cut loose with their heavy firepower from Suribachi and also from the high ground to the north of the landing beaches. And they shot up these LCI gunboats very heavily. They sank one. They totally disabled 5 of them that were left without power. This was quite a shock. And in the next 2 days, there was an effort to increase the bombardment force considerably, including some fast battleships from Task Force 58. However, once again, the bombardment was heavily focused on supporting the actual landings on the invasion beaches, not dealing with the Japanese defenses in the north end of the island. And this slide gives you a basic layout of where the invasion beaches were. You'll see the 4th and the 5th Marine Divisions are going to make the initial landing with the 3rd Marine Division in reserve. You'll see where the Japanese defenders are located on the island with those red symbols. And you'll notice that there are 3 Japanese airfields on the island, the first to the south, one in the center, and the one still under construction to the north. The main Japanese defenses are going to be located around the 2nd airfield location, and you'll hear more of that from my colleagues. And this is the famous photograph of the landing forces approaching the beaches of Iwo Jima at H hour on 19 February 1944. And with that slide, I end my presentation. I want to thank the National Museum of the Pacific War for giving me this opportunity to speak in this symposium today and to honor those who served at Iwo Jima in 1945. Thank you.